Welcome back, guys. Today I thought I'd talk a little bit about optimizing SSDs for use within Linux. Now, if you do research on your SSD, you'll find that there's a lot of disagreement within the Linux industry. If you pull up 5 different websites, do a search on how to optimize your SSD for use within Linux, you will find 5 different opinions. If you follow their procedures, you'll probably find 5 different procedures. So it can be very confusing, and if you've purchased an SSD, you want to make sure that you're A, getting good use of it, and B, not doing something or having something set up that's going to be detrimental to your SSD. So SSDs can provide a lot of performance improvements, and it's important to everyone, I think, that you get all of the bang for the buck. And so I went through and I took a look at various procedures, various suggestions, and tried to come up with one simple guide that I follow on my SSDs. Now, keep in mind that I am running a system with only SSDs. My mechanical hard drives are external drives. I don't do this to them. This is just for your SSDs. And if you have an SSD in your system and you're booting off the SSD and you're storing your data on a hard drive, the prevailing school of thought is that you set up your swap partition on the mechanical drive. So that you don't access that swap drive excessively, causing premature wear of your SSD. So I'm going to go through some of the things that I do, and we'll take it step by step. So the first thing you need to do, now by the way, I am doing this in Sparky Linux. This is the new 4.1. I downloaded it and installed it because I am a big fan of Sparky, and I like running Debian testing, which is what Sparky is based on, and I think Sparky does a lot of things right. But I'm not doing a review of Sparky Linux in this particular video. I am discussing SSDs and using Sparky as an example. Now, everything that I discuss, I believe, is applicable to Ubuntu, Debian, and Arch. And so Arch has a few things that are specific to Arch, and I'm not going to get into those on this video. But this is pretty much what you can do on a routine basis when you're setting up your SSD to use within your Linux install. So, as I mentioned, this is Debian, but everything should be the same if you're doing it on a Ubuntu system. The first, number one, let's see if hopefully this makes sense to you. First, you need to go into your BIOS, okay? And you're going to make sure that you have your BIOS set for AHCI within your Sata, okay? So all BIOS are different, so I won't be able to tell you how to do it, but when your system boots, it'll have a screen and it'll give you what usually it's a function key, what function key you press to get into your BIOS settings. Once you get into your BIOS, you want to look for SATA, S-A-T-A, and then you want to look for it'll usually give you a couple of configuration options: IDE, AHCI, sometimes there's one other. You want to make sure it's set for AHCI. Then save and exit and reboot, and that part is done. The second part is you want to find out if your SSD supports trim. So what you want to do is open up a terminal, and we will go into System Tools. Okay, so we're going to open a terminal, and you're going to copy this command. Okay, so, and this will work in Debian or Ubuntu. Put in your password, and you want to make sure you get a message that says trim supported, and then it'll say limit and a number for blocks. That's not so important. I've seen that vary anywhere from 1 to 8 to 16. As long as this trim is supported, there's not much else you want to pay attention to. So just make sure that your SSD supports trim. When you see this dataset management trim supported, you're good to go. Okay, so let's take it. Number 3. You got now when you I'm gonna open up my fstab file. Okay, so I'm gonna show you how to do that. It's in File System, etc, and then scroll all the way down to your fstab. You see it? Okay, now right now I have it. It's just read-only because I'm not opening this as root. But I want to show you how Sparky Linux, this is how they configure their drives. They don't know what you're using. They don't know whether you have an SSD or just a mechanical hard drive or what you're using, but what you want to do is while you're in your SSD, and I'm going to open LeafPad as root. So let me go to my, and I'm going to do gk sudo LeafPad. This allows me to open LeafPad as root. If I open my fstab file, okay, so now I'm in as root. I can make changes. So if I'm opening this as root, I can make any changes I want. Now, one of the things you might want to do while you're in there, and I'm going to open up another terminal. Just so I can run a different command. Okay, so lsblk space -f gives me my UUIDs. Now, when I am in Sparky Linux, and I always write everything down, but Sparky is on SDC4. You see this? So this is my this UUID should match my root partition, ending in 1178. And as you can see, it matches. And then I always like to check my swap partition to see if it matches what's showing in the system. Here is the swap, and as you can see, it ends with BDDF. Okay, so I know my partitions match, because what will happen is, if those don't match, then it will delay your boot or your shutdown. Now, I've seen it delay the boot by as much as 1.5 minutes. while the system tries to figure out which UUID is being used for swap. If for some reason these don't match, you want to make sure they match, and this is the one you want to go by, your LSBLK. So if, for example, this UUID in the swap was not the same as this swap, I would copy this UUID and paste it in here and then save. Okay, this is what you want to match to in your terminal. Okay, so now that that's done, one of the things that people disagree on is how to configure the fstab. Now, one school of thought says you need to use discard. Now, discard is a configuration option for an SSD that some people think helps with limit the frequent access to the drive needlessly. And that's what you want to limit. Everything you do here is limiting the frequent accessing of the drive without a good purpose. You want to minimize the read and write to the SSD. So far we have determined that we have SSD installed. Our SSD is capable of trim, and our AHCI is set up in Sata in the BIOS. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to add noatime to fstab. Now, noatime is limiting the checking of your file system to see if the file has been read or written to recently. This comes into play with email. You know how when you open up your email, it needs to check to see what's new, what's old, what's read, what's not read? Okay, that's where A-time comes in. The old configuration for email programs in the old days used to need A-time. It would need that A-time. The new email programs typically do not rely on that, and so you don't need the A-time. As a matter of fact, it can cause premature failure of your SSD. So in your fstab, and I have mine open as root, I'm going to add no A-time. So right after RW, I am going to type no A-time, comma. You don't want to do that to your swap. You only want to do this to your root partition. Do not mess with your swap partition. Once you have no A-time in there, you're going to save it. Okay? And that part is done. Now, as I said, there's a differing school of thought on whether to use discard, but I've read enough negatives that I do not use it. Whether or not you want to use it is entirely up to you. But for my purposes, no A-time does the job. I have used it, and I've checked my email, and I don't see any issues at all. So no A-time for me is the way to go. Okay, so we have installed our SSD. We have enabled AHCI in our BIOS. We've determined that our SSD is capable of trim, and we've added no A-time. Now, the next thing we want to do is make sure that we schedule a trim command. Now, what you can do this different ways. You can go with a weekly trim. You can do it manually once every few days. Or you can set up your system so that it automatically does it each day. Now, it really depends on how often you reboot your system. If you tend to leave your system going all the time, then you probably want to either set it up for weekly or set it up for daily. Or you can just do it manually. I'll show you how to do that also. So it's entirely up to you. But let me show you how to set it up daily. Okay, so let's pull this file. Okay, so we're gonna do LeafPad, and we are going to look at cron daily trim. Now, let's check something. You see cron daily, cron hourly, cron monthly. Now, and weekly. Now, these are basically schedules for maintenance, and I haven't changed anything on this yet. So let's take a look at this. Is the daily, and let me check something here. Okay, you can see there is no trim because it's not set up daily. So let's check hourly. There's nothing in hourly. Let's check weekly. There's nothing in weekly. And monthly, there's nothing in monthly. So what I'm going to do, and I'm going to show you how to do it, is set up to do a daily trim. So it's going to go in and run trim on my SSD once a day. Now, when you go online, there's going to be scripts that will run trim, but you have to be careful because, like in this case here, this script was written only for Intel and Samsung. So you have to enable no model check. That way it'll do it to yours, whatever the model is. So you don't want it checking the model because unless you have an Intel or a Samsung, it will not run. So here's what you want to do. We're going to have to go into cron daily, and I'm going to have to create a file called trim. You're going to open up a new file in LeafPad as super or root, and I'm going to show you what to copy in, okay? I'm going to copy this entire right to there. You see that? Okay. So I'm going to leave that so you can see, and I'm going to explain what this does. It's a command. It's basically a little program that'll run daily. And everything with the little pound sign or the hashtag, everything is basically read-only. So there's no execution. It's just explaining what's going on. So here is what you want to do. Execute fstrim-all -- no model check. That's the important part. Now I'm going to save that as, and we have to save it as etc cron daily trim. Okay, now if I go into my file system, I want to make sure that I save. Yeah, I did. Okay. Now if I go into my file system, there's my trim. So that will run the trim command daily on my SSD. And it's not going to do a model check. So whatever SSD I have in there, it's going to run the trim command. Okay? So far, just to recap, we've installed our SSD. We have enabled AHCI in the BIOS. We have run our trim command to make sure our SSD is capable of trim. We've added noatime to our fstab, and we've scheduled a daily trim operation. Now, what we have to do next is we have to activate that command. So open up a terminal, and we're going to run this command, which will basically kickstart that daily trim. It's going to make that file we just saved executable. You see the file name? etc cron daily trim. We're making it executable. So I copy in this command, and I'm going to press enter my password, and we're done. Now let's recap. Okay, so we did the AHCI. We checked to see if our SSD can support trim. We added noatime. We ran our command, our daily trim command. We set it up to be executable. Okay, so let's reboot. Okay, so once we reboot, we're going to now, the next command would be to disable our weekly trim. But I don't think we had one set up, so let's double check it. Since we're doing it daily, we don't need to do it weekly. And we don't have it set up, so we're going to bypass that. But if you had a if you looked in your cron weekly and you had a weekly trim set up, this is the command you would use to disable that. Okay, so I'll leave that right there. Okay, now the next item is if you want to do a manual If you wanted to do a manual trim operation, this is what you would type. Sudo fstrim space -v space /. Now that's going to take a little bit to run. And you, I'm not sure you want to do that right now, but that's the command. And I may do that once I'm done with the next few steps. Okay, so let's talk about swappiness. Swappiness is a value that's entered into your file that determines how often your swap is accessed. Now, if you have a swap file, let's say you're only running on an SSD, and that's my situation. I have an SSD. In most cases, it's 128 gig, and since I have 8 gigs of RAM, I usually create an 8 gig swap file. Now, there's some disagreement over whether or not you need a swap file with 8 gigs of RAM. And many, especially with an SSD, they recommend not creating a swap file on an SSD, as long as you have 8 gigs of RAM or more. I still have a swap file. Whether you use a swap file is entirely up to you. I have run without a swap file with no noticeable negative performance. And so I probably don't need one. But since I do have one, I want to reduce the amount of time spent accessing that swap file needlessly. Linux creates a frequency value usually of 60, which is, for an SSD, that's too high. So we're going to open up a file and we're going to check it. And so I'm going to open this file right here. Well, first of all, you can run a command that tells you what your swappiness is set to. So if I open up my terminal and I run this command, see that cat proxys VM swappiness? Okay, do you see that little value there of 60? That's too high for an SSD. It should be no more than 10. Most people recommend 1. I'm going to show you how to set that. Okay, so we are going to open up this file right here. And let's see. And we'll call this swappiness. First, we're going to put in the command. And bear with me, guys, because I'm gonna copy this into the show notes when I'm done, so you'll have a little guide. Okay, so if you open up this, right now it's set to 60, and it's in this etc systcontrol.conf. That's where it is. So we need to open that. Okay, so here is the file. And at the end of the file, now you see this sysctl.conf, sysctl.conf. Okay, at the end of the file, we need to copy this and put it right at the end of the file. See that? Swappiness is 1. Now I'm going to save. Okay, so but the first thing I want to do is I'm going to put this command in so that you open up the right file. And let's say you're going to use LeafPad. So make sure you have LeafPad loaded before you start this. And then add to end of file. Just like I did, at the end of the file you want to add these 2 lines. Okay? Now, when I run this command, well, we have to reboot for that to change. Okay, so I'm going to put a reboot in because the swappiness value will change only after a reboot. Okay, and I'm going to reboot and come back, and so I'll show you. Now, so that's what we're going to do right up to that point. Okay, guys? The next thing we want to do is, and I'm going to copy these in. And we're going to call this number 9. And then I'm going to copy, we'll call this number 10 for Chrome. Okay. All right, so now we're going to limit the amount of time Firefox accesses and Chrome accesses the SSD for caching of files. It can take time and it's unnecessary wear and tear. So I am going to close out my file, clean up my desktop here so that we can get on to the browser aspect. Okay. Okay, so let's first of all do Iceweasel, which is similar to Firefox. What it says is you're going to go to Preferences and you're going to go to Advanced and Network, where I am now. You see where it says Cached Web Content? You're going to check off Override Auto Cache Management and set that to 0. You can see right now it's set to 350 megabytes of space for caching of your internet files. You don't really need that. It's not conducive to smooth and long-lasting SSD management. So override that, and the recommendation is to set it to 0. Okay, and that's where we're going to leave it. So that sets up Firefox. Now we're going to set up Chrome. Okay, in Google Chrome, let's see. So we're going to hit F12, and F12 is going to bring up the side panel for developer view. Okay, you see the little this should be settings. Yeah. Okay, so sometimes there's a little gear. Sometimes there's a little gear. Sometimes it's just these three dots. So if it's the three dots or the gear, you're going to click on it, open settings, and where it says disable cache while DevTools is open, check that. And that's all you need to do. Close that out. Okay, so those steps reconfigure your browsers, whatever browser you're using, Firefox or Chrome, so that if you're using an SSD, it's going to help optimize. Now, guys, one last thing I'm going to do. I'm going to reboot, and I'll be right back with you so we can see that swappiness should now be set to 1. Okay? So I'll be right back with you guys. Okay guys, I'm back. I rebooted. Let's see. We're going to open up the show notes. This is what's going into the show notes. And we're going to check our swappiness. And this is the command that we're going to use. If you remember, it was 60 before. And it really shouldn't be more than 10. I set it to 1. And as you can see, it's now 1. And that is one of the steps we implemented to maximize the performance and the lifespan of our SSD. So that is it for this video, guys. It should be helpful. Again, there's a lot of disagreement online as to what should be done, but these are the steps that most people mention as being helpful to maximizing the lifespan and performance of your SSD. So just to recap, make sure your BIOS is set for AHCI. Run this command to make sure that your SSD supports trim. Add noatime to your fstab file only on your ext4 partition. Set up your daily trim as we talked about. Then when you add that command, make sure you follow up and make it executable with this sudo chmod command. Then reboot. If you have a weekly cron set up for trim, you can disable it by running this command here. You can manually trim your SSD by running this command. Then you need to check your swappiness by running this command here. And then again, it should be no more than 10. It's probably going to be 60 if you haven't done anything with it. And then so you want to set it to either 1 or 10. I use 1. Reboot to make that change, and then configure your Firefox or your Chrome. If you run through these 10 steps, then you will have a nicely configured SSD, and you will have done your part to make sure that it performs properly and lasts a good long time. So guys, please rate, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for stopping by the channel. and I will see you soon. Take care.